My name is Lionel Lodge and I will be your panel moderator. With us today, we have three highly experienced music industry professionals to discuss neighboring rights and IFRs education, advocacy, and community efforts. Please let me introduce our three panelists. First up is Anne Tausis. She is the CEO of Kobalt Neighboring Rights and is a co-founder of IFR and has 30 plus years experience in rights management administration, both in neighboring rights and music publishing sectors. She is passionate about bringing transparency and fairness to the industry. Anne appeared on the Billboard International Power Plays list in 2017, 2018, and 2019. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you.
And joining Anne is Naomi Asher. Naomi Asher is Vice President of Neighboring Rights at Sony Music Publishing. Naomi previously co-founded Wixon Music UK Limited, serving as Director and President from 2010 to January 2020. She co-founded IFR in 2018 after being frustrated by the lack of transparency in the neighboring rights income stream. Welcome, Naomi.
Thank you.
And joining both Anne and Naomi is Stacey Harber. Stacey Harber is the founder of Inside Baseball Music and co-founder of IFR. Stacey is a music lawyer for multi-platinum superstars, emerging artists, and the occasional billion-pound brand. She says her favorite negotiation is when she negotiated for a musical icon's appearance on The Simpsons. Welcome, Stacey.
Thanks, Lionel.
And so we're going to get right into the discussion on neighboring rights. I'm going to share the screen here, bring up our presentation. Okay, and I believe Anne is going to start.
That's right. If you can have the next slide, please. So neighboring rights, what are they and where do they come from? So neighboring rights is also sometimes called related rights or equitable remuneration. They neighbor or sit next to the publishing performance rights. So that's where the name comes from, neighboring rights. So it is a sound recording royalty for any performer who has made an audible contribution to a recording that is then subsequently played in public. So that could be in a restaurant, bar, shop, TV, radio, etc. This legislation is very much based on the Rome Convention from 1961. And then also the WPPT, which is the WIPO Performances and Phonograms Treaty from 1996. So a little bit more about this. So initially then it was the Rome Convention. So the countries who signed the Rome Convention decided that performers should be protected for the performances that they were contributing onto a recording. So it used to be that they were paid as a session musician when there were live performances on radio, but then of course the record came along and were then replacing those live sessions on radio and TV to a large extent. And then the neighboring rights were sort of introduced to cover them for payment on the recordings. And the Rome Convention then works very much on reciprocity. So it's a case of if one country plays music, then the other country has to pay in order for them to exchange money. So if you don't pay me, I won't pay you, basically. So that's very much how it works in neighboring rights. So as an example here, so the US is the big anomaly here because they don't have the traditional neighboring rights that covers then the terrestrial side of things because they didn't sign the Rome Convention. But what they did do later on in 1996, when that treaty came along, they did sign the WPPT, which then means that the US are paying for the digital side of radio. So that will be the Pandoras and Sirius XM and so on and so forth. But they don't actually pay for terrestrial in the US. And as a consequence of that, there are many countries who say because the US then don't have the terrestrial neighboring rights, then we won't pay the US performers when they're played on radio. As an example, the UK won't pay US performers for that kind of remuneration. So mentioned before, the money then comes from license fees that the collection management organizations in each country, they license the music to the users of radio, TV, shops, bars, restaurants. And generally speaking, there is no neighbor rights in streaming, but hopefully there will be a change there in the future, and we'll come into that and talk about that a little bit later on in more detail. Next slide, please. So who gets paid then? So we mentioned the performers, so that's anyone who made a noise or contributed in some shape or form to the published recording. So 50% goes to the performers on the recording, and then the other 50% goes to the label, the rights holder, or also called the owner of the recording, so who actually paid for the master. So that's kind of the split. And then of course the performer share is split amongst the performers that are on the track. So you have a featured performer usually gets the higher share, and then you have the non-featured as being the session musician rather than the main artist. They will kind of share amongst them and slightly different split, and that varies very much from country to country how that is split. And we mentioned before that any venue that plays music publicly will have to pay. And then also in the US, we mentioned that the satellite and digital radio, so subscription services and webcasting are paying. So that's what Sound Exchange are collecting quite successfully in the US. Next slide, please. So flow of royalties. So it's important here to kind of make a distinction between publishing and sound recording, because they are two separate elements. So as an example here to illustrate this, we've chosen Whitney Houston's version of "I Will Always Love You." So you have then on the left-hand side, you have the sound recordings. So that was with Whitney Houston. She's the main artist, the featured artist, and then whoever played as session musicians on that track. So 50% go to them. So you see the lineup there of keyboard, sax solo, drums, etc., etc. And Whitney Houston herself, they get the sort of split the performer share between them. And then you have the other 50% that goes to her label, which in this case is RCA. So that's the recording side of it. And then you have the publishing side on the right-hand side there. So this is what the composer-author share of the composition, and in this case, the song was written by Dolly Parton. So she and her publisher are sharing that income for the actual composition. So two separate streams of income here we're talking about, and we don't mix the two. I should mention that the CMOs, the collection management organizations that are active in the neighboring rights sphere is completely separate from those that operate in the publishing world. There's one or two exceptions, I think, in Brazil, where you have societies that do both neighboring rights and publishing, but they still treat them as separate rights. But it's the same society who deal with both, but otherwise it's completely separate societies dealing with neighboring rights. Next slide, please. So what types of income are involved then? So we talked about equitable remuneration for broadcast. So that's terrestrial, as we talked about, TV, radio, and so on and so forth. Digital, which is where the income comes from Sound Exchange. And of course, there are other countries as well who have digital radio, but it's a much smaller share in general. It hasn't sort of broken through so much in the rest of the world with digital radio as it has in the US. And then we have communication to the public. It's equitable remuneration for that bit. So we talked about bars and restaurants and so on and so forth. Satellite broadcasting and cable retransmission. There's also an element of blank tape levy and private copying. Not massive, but still it does exist in some countries. So this is where the gadget that you record on, there's a share that goes to neighboring rights for that. And then there's still some rental rights exists in Japan, among other places, where people actually rent a recording, a CD. And then there's also some in audiovisual, so where music in films and TV. So excluded, so there's no neighboring rights in synchronization. and none in interactive streaming, as I mentioned before. So Spotify, Deezer, Apple Music, etc. They do not pay neighboring rights. We're saying here that it's excluding Hungary and Spain, because in those two countries there is actually neighboring rights coming out of the digital streaming, and that is following a couple of local court cases where the law in those countries does allow the societies to go and collect that money. So we think that there are other countries that will follow on from where Hungary and Spain are at the moment. A little bit more on that will follow later on in the presentation. There's also no income, neighboring rights income in live, because there has to be the recording that is being used. And then just to mix it up a little bit, who pays for what, it varies very much country by country. So that is kind of the thing that makes neighboring rights a little bit complicated, because each country has their own little rules in how they pay through this income. And that's it for this slide. If you can move to the next one, please. So just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of how much this income stream is actually worth. So the total performance rights collections in 2020 was $2.3 billion US. That was a decrease about 10% year on year, and that has very much to do with the COVID impact, where societies, of course, have collected less money from public performance. Bars, restaurants and clubs and things have been closed big part of the year. And we're likely to see that sort of decrease continue in the next year or so. Also depends on how the pandemic, of course, develops. But in major markets like Germany, for instance, you can see there it has been over 310 million euros at one stage. It seems to be around the 200 million euros mark at the moment. UK also quite healthy, going up year by year, 271 million pounds. And France, very similar figures there. And then, of course, the US with Sound Exchange and the digital neighboring rights collection, which is massive, as you can tell there by those figures. It's quite amazing how much money they actually collect there. So it's reasonable income, and if you can get your share of that, that is all well and good. Next slide, please. So what's the catch? Well, I did mention a little bit about this before, but it's all these little rules that each country have applied or are applying historically, and whether they look at the Rome Convention and what rules that kind of they've had put in place due to that. So first of all, there are some countries that pays to everyone, no matter what. They don't look at any qualification. There's about a handful of countries, Brazil, Spain being two of them. But then there are societies that look at where the recording was actually made. So it would have, in order to qualify for payment, it has to be recorded in a Rome Convention country, or the rights holder, so the label, also the person who paid for the recording, because it could be you as an individual artist who owns the recording. You need to be headquartered then or based in a Rome Convention country. And there's some countries that pay you as performers and masters either recorded in a Rome Convention country, or if the person performing is a citizen of a Rome Convention country, or if the recording has actually been funded and paid for by a Rome Convention rights holder or record label or individual. And also some countries will qualify if it has had a simultaneous release within a Rome Convention country. I think we're getting away a little bit from this. Germany was the country who did apply this, but of course, nowadays everything it's an international release date for recordings, so this will be more applicable for I guess back catalogue, but yeah, there's a lot of different rules that do come into the picture here, and just to reiterate here then, so Rome Convention countries, there's a whole list of them, but to mention here that it includes most countries, but the US, China, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand are some exceptions, and those are the ones that didn't sign the Rome Convention way back when. But of course, now we know that the copyright law is changing in China, so there is a big change happening there, and there will be neighboring rights money being collected and paid through. Next slide, please. So just looking at some important industry initiatives, because we're talking about the qualification rules and the fact that different countries apply different rules whether to decide whether or not they're paying a particular performer. In Europe, there have been a number of cases where this has kind of been challenged, and there has been a ruling by the European Department of Justice that said that none of the EU countries should in effect discriminate people based on nationality. They should treat everyone as if they were nationals of their own country. So in the UK, all performers should be treated as UK citizens basically, and be paid accordingly. So Senna in Holland, the Netherlands, is the first country that actually has implemented that ruling. So from the 1st of January this year, they are paying everyone, regardless of qualification or previous rules that they've had. Sound Exchange have been working on a national treatment campaign, and they have in Canada didn't used to pay non-qualifying performers, so they wouldn't have paid US performers because US didn't sign the Rome Convention. Now they are paying everyone, so that's a big thing that's happened in Canada, and that was following the national treatment campaign led by Sound Exchange. And then there's a big initiative in Europe called #PayPerformers, where a number of EU countries have gone together, and it's driven by the collection management organizations in these countries, and they are lobbying the governments to actually start paying for streaming. So there's a lot of movement there going on at the moment. And as we said, this is a constantly moving landscape. In the UK, of course, the UK is no longer part of the EU, but here there's been a parliamentary hearing, and there were reports coming out of that last week that says that there should be equitable remuneration for streaming. That's kind of the recommendations, but of course now it needs to be debated and all of that, and it could very well be that we will see a change also in the UK. Next slide, please. I think that is now over to Stacey.
Thanks, Anne. So the way that you get paid your neighboring rights royalties is by registering the recordings and the releases. So what you want to do when you're making the recordings is you want as much information as possible. And that information is called your metadata. You must gather it all at the recording stage because it's really hard to go back and find it. It is the date of recording. It's the venue of recording, who played what on what date and for how long were they in the studio and what your deal is with them. The reason you want this in real time is so it's accurate, because if it's wrong, it's going to invalidate a registration and it could take years for it to get fixed, and you won't be getting that income in the meantime. And the other thing is, as the rights holder, you want to credit all the performers that made an audible contribution so that they only have to go in and claim the recording. If all your information is there from the beginning, it makes it so much easier for everyone to go in and claim. And here's another thing. If as the rights holder, you don't register the recording, no income is earned for anybody until the date that you do and the date that your information is validated. So please don't leave that money hanging, because it will be lost to you and to the performers forever. And yes, you must have ISRC codes. It is the standard worldwide. You get them issued to you either by your CMO, like in the UK, PPL, in the US, it would be Sound Exchange, whatever it is in your territory. And you get that number, and that is the biggest identifier of a recording. And you need an ISRC code for every different version of the recording. So if you do an acoustic version, separate ISRC. If you do a live version, separate ISRC. If it's on a compilation, it got a separate ISRC. Every single version, and you must register them all if you want to get paid for them all. And if you do the work, why wouldn't you want to get paid? Next slide, please. Okay, so if you don't want to either defer your payment or lose it entirely, make sure that your metadata is correct. This is a detail-oriented task. So if you're not detail-oriented, get someone who is. And if they don't pay the rights holder because there's a mistake, they're not going to pay the performer either. And the way that you know it is there's an indication within your registration when you log in. In the UK, there's a red X that appears. We're all chasing that green tick. Green tick means it's valid, everyone's going to get paid. If it's different in your territory, look it up, find out what it is. All systems will tell you if it's right or if it's wrong. So start with your ISRC and then go through everything. And here's a handy tip for you. Every country has a unique 2-digit identifier, and then you, as a rights holder, will have your own two-letter, maybe some, and then probably 2-digit identifier as well. So for me, Stacey Hope Haber Hofberg, if I was a record company, it might be UK S, and I called it after myself, UK SHH93. If I started in 1993, you will have a unique identifier as a rights holder. So use it for everything. And you can get that from your CMO. And again, every remix, different ISRC. Singles versus album versions, different ISRC. Get all the information that you can. Next, please. So who gets paid? The contracted featured performer or the featured performer is the person who stands out front and has signed a recording contract. So if you're signed to a major label, it's the person who signed the contract with the major label. For the Rolling Stones, not only is it Mick Jagger, it's the other members of the band because all their signatures are on the deal. If their signatures aren't on the deal, take, for instance, Casey and the Sunshine Band. If the Sunshine Band didn't sign that recording agreement, they are not contracted featured performers. Now, what if Mick Jagger and Lady Gaga do a duet? Well, and it's labeled the Rolling Stones featuring Lady Gaga. Lady Gaga then becomes a featured performer with them because she has signed a deal or made an agreement with them. If there's no agreement, whether it's verbal or on paper, then she goes into the non-featured category. And the non-featured performers include the background vocalists, the session players, the guy who walked into the room and said, "What's for lunch?" and that got left onto the recording. So it could be anybody who makes an audible contribution but isn't contracted as a feature. If you have questions about this category, like somebody appears on the album cover but isn't a contracted featured performer, you have to work it out and you have to come to an understanding on paper, because if you don't, it'll go into dispute and nobody's ever going to get paid. So make sure you write everything down and have a paper trail. Next, please. So there are some roles that don't pay because they don't make a sound. So an arranger, excluding the USA, doesn't get paid because what they do is tell other people how to make the noises. An engineer, because they're just twiddling the knobs. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I just mean to say that they're adjusting the sound, they're not making the sound. An executive producer, usually somebody who pays for the studio time or helps the project in another way or oversees the musical direction, but again, doesn't make a sound. Remixers will not get paid unless there's an agreement to say that they have made additional sounds on the recording and will get paid. So if they add another track, like an extra guitar track, then they should be listed as a guitarist, not as a remixer, because a remixer won't get paid without that differentiation. Same with mixers. They're only adjusting the sound. They're not making the sound. Any questions about that? You can email us at IFR. Next slide, please. So what kind of evidence do you need to prove that you are either a featured performer or a non-featured performer, but was on the track in the first place? So here are some clues, and none of this is written in stone. If your name is listed as the band or the artist on the recording, then yeah, that's easy. You are the band, you are the artist. If there's a piece of paper that says you're a featured artist, then you are. If your name is in the song title, that's good evidence as well. So remember that when you're negotiating to appear on somebody's recording, you either want your name in the title of the release or you want a contract that says you're a featured artist. You can also get a letter from somebody who is a featured artist that says you should be paid either as a producer or as a featured artist, even though you didn't sign their recording agreement. Good evidence for non-featured artists will be videos to show you singing in the background, a contract for your session rate or the day, a report from the studio itself, either on an MU form or a napkin, it's okay. Label copy that comes with the liner notes, but it must be named individual tracks. It cannot just say for the whole album, background vocals by. That's not good enough. It must be on a track by track basis. Again, letters from the featured artist confirming your contribution, that's great evidence. And something from the internet like Discogs. I know it's user generated, but if there's nothing else and that's the best you have, use it. It can work. Next slide, please. So we've been through this and did a really good job, but I'm going to reiterate. Neighboring rights is different from publishing because different people get paid. Performers get paid for neighboring rights. In publishing, the writer gets paid. And quite often they're different people. If they're the same person, then you'll get paid on both sides, but you can't confuse them. One has to do with songwriting and the other has to do with performing. Songwriters don't make noises on the actual finished recording unless they're also an artist. And they have different collection societies in most of the world, not Brazil, as Anne said. If you are both the rights holder and the artist, you must register both sides because, as I said before, if you don't register as the rights holder, you'll never get paid as the artist. If you're the writer, has no bearing on anything. If you have a publishing agreement as a writer, has no bearing on neighboring rights. They are two separate revenue streams and they never, ever cross. Next slide, please.
I think this is where I'm picking up.
I was just going to hand over to you, ladies and gentlemen, Naomi Escher.
Thank you very much. One of the questions that we get asked a lot is, are there neighboring rights for production music? Unfortunately, it's not a clear-cut yes or a clear-cut no. The answer is really yes and no. Every society treats production music differently. Some societies pay in limited situations, some not at all. Sometimes it's paid as an audiovisual right. In the United Kingdom, MCPS triple weights production music libraries. So those production music libraries actually do not get paid through the Neighboring Rights Society, PPL, here in the UK, because it is considered separate. So unfortunately, it's really not a clear-cut answer. This has changed a lot throughout the years. Production music or library music used to be exclusively background music. People, do buy out, get their production music rights bought out. But lately there has been a trend for production music to be released as a sound recording. And the thing is even if you sell or you're just contracted for work for hire, your audible contribution, neighboring rights, is not something that you can buy or sell or transfer or give away. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. to anybody. So if you've made an audible contribution on that recording, you are still eligible to collect your equitable remuneration for that contribution. There are a lot of societies like PPL, for instance, that doesn't pay, for production music, as I said, but that is because that right is paid. It's just paid through the Mechanical Society. It's paid through MCPS instead in the UK. So it's, it is a very, very tricky one. We've had people, show us their BMI statements and say, CS should be making all this money. And the answer is, well, no, not for neighboring rights necessarily, unfortunately. So it is something that it's a very tricky line. Next slide, please. So this is an important differentiation, producer versus the studio producer. In Europe, the word producer means really the person or company who owns the master recording. So it's the label, the rights holder. In Canada, they call it the maker. Whoever is responsible for funding, owning, creating in the business sense, that recording, you were talking about the producer. They earn money on the rights holder side. So if you are doing an agreement with somebody who is a rights holder at Senate in the Netherlands, it will be a producer agreement. The language gets confusing because then you have studio producers. These are the people in the room who are effectively conducting, to some extent, the sound, who, telling the musicians what to do, possibly even doing the programming on the board. They are the people who are physically in the room when they are creating these recordings. And the studio producers, because studio producer is a non-payable role, in order for a studio producer to be paid neighboring rights, you have to have additional paperwork, or you have to be credited as playing an instrument in order to earn that money. So if you are only credited as a producer because you are a studio producer, and you put keys, guitar, violin, strings, and the harmonica into the recording, unless you're credited as making all of those audible contributions, as playing those instruments, you are never going to get paid as a producer, studio producer, unless you then get extra paperwork, which is really only applicable as well in different societies. There are some societies that will pay studio producers, but it is not something that is an automatic role that you will get paid for. You have to really be credited for playing the instruments, and then also, get your sound exchange letter of direction, which I'll talk about, so that you can be paid, some of the sound exchange money from the featured artist. But it is super important to understand that difference in terms of the studio producer versus the producer. Next slide, please. So paying producers and rights holders. So in the US, Sound Exchange pays both the labels and the featured artists. And then there's non-featured artist share, which is paid by the AFM SAG-AFTRA Intellectual Property Fund. So Sound Exchange is primarily really only pays featured artists. If, as a studio producer, you have been issued a Sound Exchange letter of direction confirming that you are due a percentage of income from that featured artist, then that is applied to the track. So if it's Lady Gaga and the Rolling Stones, and you are the producer and you should get 5%, effectively they'll take 2.5% from Lady Gaga's share, and the Rolling Stones 2.5% from their share, and they will give you 5%. So you have to have that letter of direction signed by both parties. In the UK, PPL pays both the labels and the performers. In order for the producer to get paid as an eligible studio producer, you have to have an extra form, an eligible studio producer form, signed by the featured artists. Again, if you are credited as playing an instrument, you don't need that extra paperwork. In Belgium, you've got different societies that pay the performers, that pay the labels. In Brazil, as Anne mentioned, the societies pay everything, which gets really confusing. But you do have many places where it's more like Belgium, where you have separate, where you have the labels that get paid on one side, the performers get paid on the other side, and studio producers don't get paid. So again, you really need to be credited as playing the keys or the organ or the saxophone or whatever it is that you've done. The next slide, please. And I've mentioned some of this already. Sound exchange requires letter of direction. In the UK, you need an eligible studio producer form. Swiss Perform has an artistic producer form. There are other countries as well that have the artistic producer form. And then many countries don't pay if the credit is only producer. So it is super important that you get that in place. If you are only credited as being a producer and you're not credited as playing an instrument, you don't get paid, but you can be credited as being a programmer or a conductor. Those are payable roles. Even instruments is a payable role. It's just the word producer isn't a payable role. Next slide, please. And here's an example of how the correct language is a make or break as to whether or not you get paid. If you're credited as a beats producer, that will not be eligible to collect neighboring rights because producer is a non-payable role. If you are credited as a drum programmer, then you will be eligible to get neighboring rights because programmer is a payable role. So it's the same thing. I know it's the same thing. Everybody knows it's the same thing. It all has to do with the wording. It has to do with how you are credited. So it is super important to make sure you are credited properly so that you can maximize your income. Next slide, please. There are a few, sound exchange is different from the rest of the world in a lot of ways. I've already mentioned the sound exchange letter of direction. Nowhere else really does percentages the way that sound exchange does. So that's sort of the first main difference, is to even be able to assign a percentage is just not something that is really done that way anywhere else. Most countries have effectively an algorithm. So you say, okay, I'm a featured artist or I'm a non-featured artist. And then depending on how many featureds and how many non-featureds, there will be an algorithm that will be applied. And then that will create a payment structure on the performer side. So that would come out of the performer, the 50% performer share. The algorithm would be applied and the performers would be paid accordingly. The other 50% would go to the rights holders. The rights holders wouldn't receive any of the performer money unless there's non-qualifying income that would be paid through to them. But otherwise, it's kept very separate. And as Stacey mentioned, in most countries, if the rights holder does not register the recording, the performers will never be paid ever. You have to, as a rights holder, register those recordings. Now, in the US, it is different. It's because the legislation is different. It's because the US did sign the WPPT, but they didn't sign the Rome Convention. So you have Sound Exchange paying the featured artists. Then everything Sound Exchange collects, they pay a 5% over to the AFM SAG-AFTRA Intellectual Property Fund. And then that is split between session musicians and background vocalists, who are then paid from the fund. It is super important to make sure you know who is a featured artist and who is not a featured artist. Otherwise, you can create a conflict at Sound Exchange. Sometimes that's very clear. Unfortunately, sometimes it's not, especially with older bands. And the definition of who is a featured artist from Sound Exchange is a very loose definition. I mean, obviously, sometimes it's very clear. If you're Elton John, you're Elton John, and that's the end of the story. But if you're, if you're the Rolling Stones and you had Bobby Keys play the saxophone, it's really important that Bobby Keys' camp knows that he's a non-featured performer, so he's not going to claim any of the Sound Exchange featured artist share, because otherwise it will create a conflict. He would get his share via the AFM SAG-AFTRA Intellectual Property Fund. The rights holders also in the US do not need to have registered the recording at Sound Exchange for the performers to get paid. But this is really the only place where that happens that way. So it is important to make sure, especially if you are the rights holder, your company is, as well as being a performer, that you make sure everything is registered at Sound Exchange, but also separately outside of the US, because the data is quite different and the way things work is quite different. And in order to maximize your income, you really need to separate the US as a territory from other countries. Next slide, please. Estates. So after a performer dies, passing on the neighboring rights to a beneficiary can be incredibly difficult, invasive, annoying, and uncomfortable at a time where families are really at their most vulnerable. You need various pieces of paperwork, a will, a deed of probate, a reason why you don't have a deed of probate, if there is a reason, if you don't have one, the ID of the new beneficiary, and any other documentation in the chain. And because neighboring rights are equitable remuneration, cannot be sold, assigned, transferred, or in any other way given to anybody but the designated beneficiary, it is just super important to prove that the designated beneficiary is that person, is the designated beneficiary. Next slide, please. This is, again, just more, if somebody dies in the US and the estate doesn't go to through probate, then you will need a small estate affidavit or something similar to account for that lack of probate. Otherwise, you'll have holes in your documents and you won't be able to prove the chain. And all the societies really do go out of their way to pick holes in the documentation. So it is really important to have everything lined up. And especially if you have a codicil in your will that specifically mentions equitable remuneration, then you are going to be able to pass that on a lot easier if you don't. Actually, IFR has an example of a codicil template in the members only area of the website. You can always take a look at that if you become a member of IFR. It's just important, if you've got that language, you will save yourself, well, you will save your family members a lot of headache later on. Next slide, please. And living trusts, which are very common in some countries, they are not death documents. So that is something that has been an issue, and you need to make sure you have death documents that are a chain, and living trusts are not part of that. And just go back to the key words, equitable remuneration. So that is really important. If you just say you're passing along royalties, that isn't going to include equitable remuneration. Next slide, please. And this is just a little bit about IFR. So please check out our website and join. The website is ifr.co.uk. And we are creating a sister company, which is IFR Ed, but all of our really key information is on ifr.co.uk. We have sponsorship packages, we do education courses, webinars, tutorials. So please, please, please get in touch with us. And check out the website, become a member, and if you have any questions, feel free to let us know. And Lionel, I think I'm gonna pass it to you for questions.
Well, that was great. That was great. Thank you very much, all three of you. Yes, I do have a few questions. One is, with the new legislation in China regarding neighboring rights, do you have, can you give an idea of how that will affect Chinese or Chinese-based artists globally for their neighboring rights? Do you think that's opening it up?
Yeah, I would say that if China opens up and starts collecting and paying neighboring rights locally, then the international world will sort of do the same. And we talked earlier about reciprocity. So the collection management organization in China that gets the job to collect locally will then likely enter into reciprocal agreements with other collection societies around the world. And then you have that exchange of money going between countries that way. That's sort of how it works. So things are looking very positive, definitely. And fingers crossed that we will see some movement very soon.
Okay.
Chinese musicians shouldn't wait to become members of the societies. They should go ahead and become members of the societies, like especially places like Sound Exchange in the US, where they can already earn money because there's no reciprocity issues. Sound Exchange will pay everyone. So they should definitely go ahead and make sure that they do that. And if they want to get in touch with us, we can, help give them some advice and whatnot from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like the rights holders, like the recording companies and also featured performers and non-featured performers, do they need to register with CMOs all over the world? Like you're talking about Sound Exchange and then...
Not necessarily, yeah. I mean, there's a couple of different things that you can do. I mean, we started talking about the society and the fact that there has to be a local society in order for things to start moving. But of course, you can, as if you're an artist who's been successful outside of China, then of course there are ways you should be able to go about. And we mentioned Sound Exchange being one of them, who don't actually look at that reciprocity and pays everyone regardless. You can become a member directly with the individual societies around the world. You don't have to go through your kind of home society. It's a little bit complicated, but it's definitely doable. And if you know where you have activities or where you have airplay, where there's money to be collected, that could be a way of doing it. Then, of course, you have agents working in this space, neighboring rights agents, who would do that work on your behalf. And, you know, they would then sign you up rather than you doing it yourself, because you have to remember that when you go to these societies in the individual countries, you usually have to speak the language and understand, you know, forms that they ask you to sign and things like that. And that could be quite tricky to kind of maneuver around all of that. So there are a couple of different options that you can utilize if you're a performer, definitely.
Right. So, but it's generally not a good idea if I just sign up, just if I'm in the UK and I just sign up to PPL.
You can do that. You can do that as well, but then you kind of rely on, if you sign up to, you don't have to sign up to your home country either. You can, if you're Chinese, of course, you can go to PPL in the UK and sign up to them and actually let them do the international collections for you. There's kind of there's a number of different ways of doing it. So that would also be one way of doing it. So thanks for bringing that up.
Right. Okay. And yes, that basically covers my questions about the rights holders and the featured artists needing to register in many countries, because it is quite a complicated landscape. And like you have said, in many countries, the laws are very different and the amounts are very different and the registration is very different. Can you talk a bit about what IFR, the work IFR is doing to support creatives and spread the education of neighboring rights?
Yeah, so we are doing quite a lot, actually. We have sort of three different categories of areas that we're really focusing on. Education is a key category, doing things like this, webinars. Stacey can talk a bit about, you know, some of what she's been doing with people who have, you know, come to us and said, you know, what should we do? Should I get a representative or not? You know, both Anne and myself work as agents. So Stacey's the neutral party who, you know, works as part of a committee to help that out. Mm-hmm. So I'll pass that over to you.
Yeah, so we have a list of IFR member representatives like Anne and Naomi, who do represent performers with their neighboring rights all over the world. We also have a list of non-IFR members, so that we are completely neutral and transparent if somebody wants an agent. And if they don't want an agent and they want to do the registrations themselves, then we will advise and help them, guide them. I mean, I've gone as far as sitting with somebody on the phone while they were doing the registration and helping them tick every box and answer every question. We just want to help people get paid. And the only way to get paid is to register correctly. So that our non-society committee does that.
Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of material on our website. Once you're a member, you can look on the website and we've got a list of all the CMOs with links to their websites. So, you know, if you want to do it yourself and just want a source of information, if you become a member of IFR, you can go to that, you can use that. We have a glossary on the website so you can see what all these different words that we're throwing about mean. You know, so there is a huge amount. We have, you know, almost all of our webinars are on that members only portion of the website. So you can go back and rewatch and hear us answer those questions. So a huge amount of material. You know, so the education portion is really very pronounced.
And I think even if you, sorry, go ahead, Stacey.
Another benefit that we hadn't anticipated, but definitely exists, is that members have been asking me legal questions that have nothing to do with neighboring rights, but have to do with either the record deals or the publishing deals, or just general questions about the different copyrights, the P in the circle, the C in the circle. So you have access to us as professionals in the music industry about the business of music.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was going to add, but that basically adds to it, that even if you want to have an agent or somebody else do the paperwork and do the registration for you, it's also very good to understand what the process is. And with IFR, you know, the membership is very, very reasonable. The the yearly membership fee. And with IFR, then you can get a full understanding if, having being educated, even if somebody else is handling it for you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because unless you understand a little bit about it, you don't know what the best choice for you is in terms of how you manage this income stream. But that is the most important thing as well, is that however you do it, that you make sure you do something. If you have, if you have been on recordings, contributed to recordings which are played around the world, you should make sure that you have something set up so that you can collect that income, because you've done the work. You should get paid for it as well. So it's very important.
Right. And just, at a point in the presentation, you were showing for different years, the different societies or different countries, the collection of neighboring rights, the amounts they've collected. And with this, do you find, can a session player or a non-featured artist make a good living with neighboring rights? Is this something that comes up, or is this just something that, because a lot of artists I talk to don't really know that much about it, and then they write it off as being, well, it can't be that much.
It depends what you mean by much, but if you're a non-featured, a session musician who've been on a number of recordings, it depends on, of course, which recordings and how many recordings and how successful those have been. But yes, definitely, if you've been on successful recordings, we're talking probably tens of thousands of dollars, as opposed to hundreds of dollars. So definitely there's income out there. And also, we should mention, we didn't actually say that in the presentation, but most societies you can go back and retroactively claim. So it's between 3 and 5 years. So you might think, oh, well, I did a recording 4 years ago, that money will be gone now. It's actually not the case. You have a chance of going back in time and claim retroactively.
As long as the rights holder registered the recording.
Yeah, going back to what you said earlier, yeah.
And as long as the recording is getting airplay, that's the other thing. It really, as Anne said, has to do with which recordings. I used to work with a session player who drummed on a Christmas song that was played regularly from, October to January, amongst other things. But, that being constant income for him, it was sort of like, definitely high 5 figures a year, and primarily a huge amount of that came from the Christmas songs.
Now, is this true? It was something I've been told, that if I'm a guitar player on a recording and I do 2 overdubs, do I get paid extra for those overdubs in neighboring rights, or do I just get the one for the fact that I was the guitar player?
It varies by society. Some societies pay for each. So if you play acoustic guitar and electric guitar, some societies will pay you for both. Other societies divided by the number of session players.
Right. Okay. Any other points that you think we should put in? I think we've gone over.
Any?
No, I think we've covered everything.
But we always get loads of questions that it's hard to go into, into a very detailed discussion or presentation in a short space of time. So there's always questions after the event. As we mentioned here, the IFR website, if you do become a member, there's tons of information on there that you can reference back to. We're happy to answer questions as well, of course, if you reach out to us once you are a member. And then there's the education packages that Naomi did talk about. If there was anyone who was interested in sort of doing it for a group of people, a company or something, and doing a bit of education in neighboring rights, then we could do that as well.
And so you do offer this if I'm a company starting up and we're looking at neighboring rights, and we can get a package from IFR.
Yeah, or a law firm. I almost came to blows with the lawyer who said, I drafted the will and I've included all royalties and every court should make that good enough. And I'm just screaming my head off going, no, that his family will not get his neighboring rights. Even if you can do it, it will take years before somebody acquiesces. Just use the language, do the codicil, sign it today.
Yeah.
So if you're a law firm and you want to know how to protect your client, come and get a seminar from us.
Great.
Yeah, become a member and get a copy of the codicil language.
Mm-hmm.
Easy.
And this is a big part of what you guys have talked about today, is that the information, the data, the clarity of it, the completeness of it is very important.
Yes.
And putting a bit of time in now pays off a lot in the long run.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
If you want to make a living from music, then it is your business. You should never be embarrassed to discuss business aspects.
And what happens to the money if I am playing on a bunch of recordings and I don't register and I'm not collecting my neighboring rights? What actually happens to that?
Well, then somebody else gets that money eventually. You know, different rules for different societies. But if you haven't registered, nobody's registered on your behalf. If you didn't have anyone assigned to do that for you, eventually, once it's gone past these 3 or 5 years that we were talking about, that you can claim retroactively, it either goes back into the pot and kind of spread amongst all performers who have claimed in a subsequent year. Some countries would actually take that performer share and pay it through to the label if it wasn't claimed. So it depends on society, but yeah, it will kind of benefit somebody else definitely if you don't go claim it.
Right.
I think some of the Scandinavian countries pay to an arts fund, anything that's unclaimed. And also just really fast to just on the differentiation of in terms of when you talk about the 3 to 5 years backdating, we are talking about the airplay. So if you recorded something in 1970, that's fine. You can get paid for that, but you're only going to get paid for the last 3 to 5 years of recording. So don't think that if you haven't recorded something in the last 3 to 5 years, it's not going to get paid. It can be 50 years ago. It's just that it's only going to be airplay from the last 3 to 5 years.
Exactly. So even if you did record a long time ago, it's kind of the airplay years when the performance has sort of taken place, that is what counts. Yeah.
Okay. I think that nicely rounds up a lot of information on neighboring rights. And as you guys have said, people, if they want more information, they should come on ifr.co.uk and sign up to be a member. And lots of extra information in depth on the site for members. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And a big thank you to Kanjan for inviting us.
Yes, definitely.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I think that's it. We're going to sign over to the next panel. Okay. Bye. Thanks.
Bye.